Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. We're glad you're here. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so special, they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore and maintain these special places that are open for you and I to enjoy 365 days a year. Places like Shanks Ferry, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Pelham Hills, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us all better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture is a 40-minute presentation followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to have them answered by the end of the presentation. This is the first lecture of our 2022 winter and spring season. Our next Nature Hour will be February 9th on the topic of Why Welsh Mountain, presented by Marianne Schlegel. If you haven't seen Marianne present, she's an amazing naturalist and I highly recommend it. You can learn more and pre-register for this lecture and other events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, who include Clark Associates, Electron Energy, Rettew, Stauffers of Kissel Hill, PennStone, Nimblist, and Dart Container. The generosity of our sponsors allows us to do our incredibly important work, including bringing Nature Hour to you. And now I would like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, How Lancaster Can Change the Way We Think About Climate Change, presented by Eric Sauter. And when I think about climate change, it feels like this, at times, it feels like this huge crisis that's starting and growing exponentially that doesn't have a solution. Eric has a different take on it than I do. Eric is a social innovator focused on climate change with a background in engineering, sustainability, and design. Despite the looming challenge of climate change, Eric is resolutely optimistic about the potential for people to implement solutions that build a more vibrant and equitable world. For the past 5 years, he has worked alongside farmers and natural resource professionals to create new programs and support for farmers to sequester carbon, generate ecosystem services, and create resilient agricultural economies. This vantage point allowed Eric to see the potential for greater regional climate collaboration. He founded Regen, a Lancaster-based nonprofit to catalyze regeneration across rural and urban communities. Regen works with individuals, businesses, and communities to identify and implement place-based climate solutions that capitalize on a region's unique strengths and resources. Eric and his wife, Ruth, live in Lancaster with their 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Eric Sauter.
Thank you so much, Keith. So I want to start off here tonight framing why we're thinking about this. Perhaps you've seen the climate stripes before, but these are visual representations of global temperatures from 1895 to 2020. This is for the whole globe, but you can look at these for individual states and countries around the world. And these temperature bands, these colors represent the average global temperature for that year, for every year. And you can see very clearly from this how, as we move from left to right, how the years get warmer and warmer and warmer. So this is really the challenge that we're faced here with climate change. This is a direct result of how annual global CO2 emissions have climbed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And this has pretty much gone without stop on an exponential curve. And why do we care about this? Scientists estimate that over the next 50 years, we're at risk of losing 1/3 of all plant and animal species to extinction. By 2100, rising sea levels will threaten and displace more than 200 million people. And if you really only care about the financial bottom line of all of this, by 2050, climate will shave an estimated 23 trillion off of global GDP. So the impacts of this are really big. And it's not like we haven't tried to do things about this either. We've really looked at trying to respond to climate change, both as individuals and as governments. And I want to spend just a little bit of time in both of those and why we're hitting walls with both. So with individuals, I think the environmental movement has done a really great job of making people feel really guilty about their individual impact. And, you know, a lot of this is for a good reason. Is the average American, our per capita emissions are 3 times that of the average European. The result of this is that it would take 5 Earths if everybody lived like we do. So we've tried to do our best. You know, we're adjusting our thermostats and trying to drive less and all these things. But one of the things that I found really interesting here over the pandemic in 2020, you know, as many of us could stop doing a lot of these things. We didn't travel. We tried to work from home if that was possible. And the results of that were that global emissions dropped by 6%, only 6%. This was the largest systems disruption that we could imagine to the globe. And it really only changed emissions by 6%. And all indications are that here in 2021, at least the US emissions were right back to where they were in 2019. And I would imagine that we'll keep on that climbing rate. So that's what we've been dealing with as individuals. On the other side, looking at governments, we have the unique distinction as the US of being the only country to have exited and then re-entered the Paris Agreement. But it's not like we're alone in our climate inaction, or that we're particularly unique in our lack of climate action. If we look at the overall gap between where we are with emissions globally and where we need to be based on Paris, which gets us to a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, we still have really significant gaps between the existing pledges and targets that countries are following right now and where we need to go. So even though US has kind of a unique distinction of being the place that you could point to and say, look at what they haven't done, this is a shared global problem that all of us hold together. And it brings up a real question about, is there hope? Certainly the atmospheric chemistry of climate change is a really dire problem, but this lack of hope, I think, is just as concerning in comparison. I think this is really just as big of a problem. And we see this voiced very clearly by young people. This was from one of the youth climate strikes a few years ago. According to a 2021 study, 56% of young people agree with the viewpoint that humanity is doomed, which is a direct result of our social inaction. And I thought I cared about climate change a lot for the past 15 or so years. But then when I had these two little people, I realized how much more I care. And it's really for them that I'm working for climate change. I also bring these posters up from World War II because obviously the Nazis inspire action easier than an invisible gas. But I do think it's an interesting contrast right now with the hopelessness that we all seem to feel in regards to climate, with other times in our history where people responded to seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Right now, climate change is the biggest challenge that the world has ever faced. And I wonder what opportunities might exist for a similar camaraderie where we all feel like we're pulling together and moving in the same direction. So obviously for this to be possible, we'd need solutions and some kind of strategy. And fortunately, we have that. There's an incredible study that was done in 2016 by a group called Drawdown that categorized and ranked the top 100 solutions for reversing global warming. And this is kind of what they look like. And a few high-level takeaways from this for me are that, there's no like silver bullet. There's no single thing that if we did that, it's all taken care of. But instead, it's this array of small solutions. And it really takes all of us working in all of these areas. A couple other things from this are that at a high level financially, these solutions globally pay for themselves by 2.5 times before 2050. So even if you're just looking at bottom line economics, it makes sense to do this work. And that's including all of the solutions that don't even have a positive return, that we're only doing them for the climate reasons alone. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as we look at these big global solutions. Then another part of this that has been a really influential takeaway from me is that 12 of these top 20 are solutions that are based in land and food. And so they're highlighted in orange and green here. And these are solutions that, to me, are deeply connected to rural communities. And so as I was reading this, it started making me ask the question, so we can't just think about how we can't just skip over rural communities with climate change. And so much of the momentum and work that we've seen globally in climate change has been focused almost exclusively in cities. So with Drawdown as a motivation, I started working about 5 years ago for a company here in Lancaster called TMAG. It's an agricultural consultancy that does a lot of other water conservation work on farms. And my role there has been to build a regenerative agriculture division within the company. We developed a new service, writing regenerative farm plans to help farmers to transition and adopt more regenerative management. There have been a lot of things that I've learned from my time at TMAG, and a couple things that I want to share that I believe are really key here. One is that it's through this work that I really first encountered the idea of regeneration. And to contrast that with sustainability, I had a professor in college that talked about sustainability by saying, if I told you that my marriage was sustainable, you probably wouldn't be all that excited for us, would you? So sustainability is great, but in many ways, it's trying to be less bad, to lessen the impact that we have on the world as humans. And regeneration is not just this less bad idea. It's really asking, how can we bring ecosystems back to life with the work and our engagement as humans in the world? And to me, that was such a more powerful call. Like, that was something that could really make me want to get up out of bed in the morning and work for that. A few other takeaways for me from my time in agriculture. So from Drawdown, this first bottom line important thing is that we don't meet our global climate goals if we ignore rural communities. Big solutions exist there, and we need to be working in rural communities. And second, we've all witnessed change. So just about everybody has advised me not to talk to farmers explicitly about climate change, but instead to talk about other adjacent things. But in my experience, farmers have been very open to these conversations. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Few people are more connected to natural cycles than farmers, and they see the changes. One farmer told me that things aren't just different from when his grandfather farmed this land, but they're different from when he took over 10 years ago. So farmers are deeply connected to climate. they see these shifts in cycles. And I don't believe that climate change needs to be a charged topic, especially when we think about climate at a more local scale. I had a farmer who described the Green New Deal as just the epitome of federal overreach and excess spending. And then he dove in and really listed the priorities and things that we need to focus on, like building strong agricultural communities that produce healthy, nutrient-dense foods that improve community health and economic resilience. And I said, you know, many of these things are core tenets of the agricultural component of the Green New Deal, and said, like, I bet if there were a local Green New Deal, you'd actually like a lot of it. And he paused for a little while and chuckled and said, you know, you're probably right. So I think there's a window and an opportunity to think about what climate looks like at a local scale that decouples it from more of the partisan energy that climate typically gets swept up into at the national scale. So all of these things have led me to this vision for local climate action. And to me, this effective local climate action would have to be something that measurably improved lives, that strengthened local communities, that created jobs, was rural and urban, and was bipartisan. And this is the foundation for the nonprofit that Keith mentioned that I have founded, called Regen. We work to identify and implement local climate solutions for a more resilient future. And the work begins here in Lancaster. And Lancaster is really important for this, and I want to dive into that. I think Lancaster is unique because it's a really meaningful scale. It's not too big, it's not too small. It's close to all of these major urban centers. And because of that, it has a strong brand, both as an urban place and as a rural place. It's also a place that's made a lot of really impressive environmental progress already. We see the articles and we know the challenge of water that exists here in Lancaster, but coming from agriculture, I've also seen how much we've already done. A lot of the carbon markets that are emerging are targeting farms in the Midwest where there's maybe 5% adoption of no-till and cover cropping. We're at 60 or 70% here in Lancaster, and farmers have been doing it for 40 plus years. So it's a really interesting geography of leadership in a number of different environmental fields. I talked about how Lancaster is known for its urbanness and for its ruralness. It's interesting that Lancaster is actually about 0.1% off in its ruralness to urbanness ratios to the rest of the United States. So there are really important ways, if that rural urban divide is particularly important in climate, which I believe it is, where Lancaster is representative in really core ways to the rest of the US. And then finally, there are a lot of unlikely precedents where Lancaster has done really awesome things that I think we can often look over, but could be leaders and other, could indicate our ability to respond to climate change too. We have the highest density of benefit corporations in Lancaster. My wife works for Church World Service, and our refugee resettlement here in Lancaster is really impressive. If we can build on this foundation, I think climate change is another area where we actually could take leadership as Lancaster, and where it would mean something on a national scale. So because so many other regional planning targets have focused on 2040, I've chosen to view that as a timely goal for us to also reach carbon neutrality as a county, not just as a city. And this is a really big deal because the US does not have examples of places that look like Lancaster that are responding boldly to climate. So my vision here is that we shift from a sense of hopelessness to one of abundance, and that we see politically purple Lancaster make real climate progress in a way that becomes a model for the rest of the US, and that we do so while creating jobs, empowering people, and building resilient communities. So I want to dive into what I think some of that work could look like and some of the things that we're building through Regen. So first, we recognize that these are specific services and things that need to be tailored for communities, businesses, and individual households. We are developing services to support each of those through climate strategy. So being able to understand, where emissions are coming from right now and their magnitude, and then developing climate action plans to know where do we go from here, knowing that information. But oftentimes places get stuck after that. And so figuring out how to cultivate stakeholder engagement so that those plans actually don't just sit on the shelf, but become real things that transform the organizations or communities that they were written for. And then I also believe that there's a lot of gaps. There are missing tools, they're missing things that it'll take to be able to scale the action to where it needs to be. And that's a place where we really want to try to identify what are those missing pieces that would allow us to really make this work reach its potential. And so that's a core innovative role that I think has been missing in the climate space, especially at the scale of communities. So a few examples of this work, beginning with quantifying challenges. We delivered the first comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory for Lancaster County, and I can make that available after the presentation. This is the same kind of analysis that was completed for Lancaster City several years ago, but not at the county scale. So these types of analyses can be kind of politically challenging. So it was a role that we could fill to bring this forward. And the results are really important because it allows us to understand as a community the magnitude of emissions and where they're coming from, what sectors are really big and important, and to understand the impact of those. So this is a glimpse of what those emissions by sector look like. But then we were also able to kind of take a step back from that and say, why do we necessarily care about emissions and this fuel use? And we put a dollar value to the fuels that we collectively as Lancaster are buying and burning, and it comes to $2 billion. Lancaster County, collectively, all of us together are spending $2 billion every year on fossil fuels. And it's not like we have local mining or extraction industries that are deep vested interests that really want this to, like, nobody here wants to be spending that money, really. And I just threw the other fact in there to remind you of the magnitude of this. Like, this is an extraordinary give every other day that we're giving to fossil fuel companies. And so this is a high level reason, why we would want to do something about this and keep these dollars here in our pockets. And so to start thinking through, what would it take to do something about this? Like, what are the solutions? What would it look like to actually do something to respond to climate here locally? I dove back into to drawdown again, because when I get to the end of that book, it's exciting. And you say, oh, great, there's a way out, there's a pathway for the world, but what do we do here? And so we felt that it was really important that we'd be able to localize those solutions to communities and to understand, what would our solution set look like? What are the highest priority things here in our place. So we've been working to localize these solutions for Lancaster. This analysis isn't public yet. We're just about done with it. If anybody wants to help, let me know. But I'll give you a glimpse at how some of this works. Like, this is a tool from Google's Project Sunroof, and I think it captures really interestingly how you can get a much more granular understanding of what a solution could look like. So you can understand, you can use this tool to look at your own home and see whether or not you have a good roof for solar at your house. But you can also look at a broader geography like a county and see what's the total viable solar installation capacity on Lancaster rooftops, or what energy production could result from that. So we can use this to get a sense that of how big the solar industry would have to be here locally, like what's the capacity for this particular solution in this place. And it reframes how you would think about a solution. Like, instead of thinking about the incremental growth, like the solar industry grew this much since last year, you say, well, how big does it have to get, and how big could it get, and what would it look like to get there? So we can see that, for example, we could meet 30% of our existing electric demand and create 300 jobs if we were aiming to complete this work by 2040, just by putting solar on rooftops. So it's that kind of analysis that we get to do through this work. And here's a glimpse at where we are right now with the mix of solutions for Lancaster. This will change. It's an evolving thing, but again, it gives you the same kind of sense that the large drawdown analysis did, that we have an array of solutions. There's no silver bullet. We need all of these things, but it helps you to prioritize how would we go about actually doing this work. So there have been a number of phenomenal volunteers that have worked on this analysis, as well as folks from both F&M and Millersville over the last couple of years. So this is something exciting that's really getting close. Then I talked a bit about our support for businesses and organizations to develop climate action plans, to understand where their emissions are coming from, and develop these plans to go forward. We did not write this plan for the Center region as Regen all, but one of the core key authors on it has joined our team as our climate strategist. So these plans are really important because they provide that roadmap for where we're going and how to get there. And then you could also imagine that we want to know where we are on that path. How could we measure trends and know, are we getting to this goal for our community or business? Then I had mentioned other tools and things that could help accelerate this process, bring new financial resources to climate here locally. One of those tools that we're developing is a local community climate fund. And this functions a lot like offsets, carbon offsets, but done here locally. So you can imagine carbon buyers who want to put money forward to see their emissions be offset through projects in the local community that sequester the same amount of carbon. So my challenges with some of the existing offset markets are that our trust. You often need to pay a lot for verification to know that these projects really are doing what they say they're doing. And so as a result of that, often only big projects are able to get funded. And then in addition to that, these projects are often global, somewhere around the world. And while that is good, you don't necessarily have a real connection to those or be able to see the fruits of your offsets in your community. So we developed a tool to be able to go through your own personal emissions as a household and walk through that, and then see your footprint, and then be able to pay to offset those emissions. And the power of this is that even at a decently small cost per ton, household emissions, the cost of offsetting household emissions isn't necessarily that significant. But if even 1% of Lancaster households were to purchase offsets, we'd be generating a $1.5 million offset fund every year to help implement some of these projects. So I'm interested to see how projects like this could grow. I think one of the things that it could do most effectively, even more than any kind of hope of a large budget behind it, is to give people a sense that there's something that they can do right now, even if there's lots of other complicated things that they want to do in their home to be reducing offsets in their home or in their business. But then these funds are going to local projects and initiatives that will be transparent and verifiable, chosen to maximize impact with both the climate and the community. And we really want these to be projects that create jobs and drive a measurable economic impact here in our communities. So I want to just step back a little bit and take a look at what I would kind of identify as a bit of a theory of change for how Regen works, and how I believe that we can grow. And the first is where we started earlier today, recognizing the importance of hope. I think that's what Drawdown has hit on very powerfully in their work, that there are solutions to climate change. There are things that we know we can do right now, and that by implementing them, it would move the needle. It would really make a difference. I think it's important to bring that narrative home. We started this with our first public launch here in early December. Regen hosted a TEDx event at TELUS 360, and we'll share the link to the videos from those talks on the video of this recording afterwards. The talks were a collection of community leaders here in Lancaster. Phil Wenger from the Conservancy was among them, but where those leaders connected the work that we know them for, like land conservation or water or agriculture, connected that work to climate and said, this is why climate change is important for the work that I do. And then helped us envision what a future could look like in a 2040 where we did the work for climate that we needed. So it helped us all to dream about that future and why we want to work for that. So I'd really encourage you to dive into those talks if you haven't gotten a chance, because it presents a really holistic vision for what a Lancaster could look like in the future. And I want to be pulled forward by dreams like that. At the end of the day, I don't see the work of climate as being a sacrifice or a negative impact. I see it being something that could deliver a better world for us. So then, as we start to believe that there could be something better, we need to know where we are and what solutions could result from that. And so that's the work that I showed with the inventory and with the drawdown analysis, to be able to see, what do we do here and what are the high level impacts of that? Why would we do this as an economic strategy? Why is this important socially for our communities? And then that gives us the foundation to set bold goals. And here in Lancaster, I believe those goals are particularly relevant as an opportunity to set an example for how other places in the US could follow. Then the carbon, the community climate fund that I shared is a chance to mobilize early adopters. People maybe who've voted for candidates who said it's important that we put a price on carbon. Well, it's an opportunity, regardless of whether that comes from on high from political offices, to say, I'm recognizing a price on carbon and I want to see that go into my community to see real work happen. And that money is not going to transform everything. It's not going to solve nearly all of the challenge, but it starts to get things happening. And from there, I think it builds the foundation for making it possible for everybody. There's a really phenomenal group that I'd encourage you to look into called Block Power. It's working in New York. They recently received a contract with the city of Ithaca to decarbonize all 9,000 of the buildings in Ithaca, so commercial and residential, by 2030. So this is a short-term kind of thing. And it was done because Ithaca has put forward their own local Green New Deal. And so there's legislative interest behind it. But you're probably seeing the current in my beliefs and work that I don't particularly expect any governmental structures to do any of this stuff. And I'm really interested in what it looks like. What are the opportunities, even if we don't get federal legislation, if we don't get necessary state legislation, even if we don't get local cooperation to do climate work, how can we still make it happen? And the Block Power models really show how it could happen. They bring outside investment dollars in to see that this work gets done. And as a result, everybody's paying less for their utility bills. I could imagine a scenario where even if we didn't have the mandates that said this is what we have to do, that there was still a pathway to see that it was the best opportunity that anybody had to be doing this work, and that it made the most financial sense right now to do it. So that's how I see us making the jump from the people that are bought into this already to just making this the best choice for anybody. And that's the kind of scale that I think we need to actually get to the climate implementation that's needed for where we are. So what can you do right now today? The first thing that I'd recommend is for you to take a look at your own household emissions. Dive into our calculator on our website. There's the button for the carbon footprint. Go into that, gather the data from your home on your energy use and transportation, food, and what kind of things you buy, and figure out what your footprint is. And from on the website, you're also able to purchase offsets, and that will enable us to do projects that offset your carbon footprint. We also have climate action planning tools on there to help you figure out what else you could do to lessen those payments every year, because that's really the goal of this, right? That we don't have to pay for the offsets, that's the stopgap measure right now to enable the work while you do the other stuff in your home. So that's the first thing that I'd recommend. And please reach out and ask questions. It's still early days of testing the tool. It's something that we developed in-house. So your feedback on how usable it is and what kind of features and things would make it better are certainly appreciated. We won't be offended at all. Second, bring us to your business or to your community, to your township. We can help to develop those plans and strategies for how you get a handle on where emissions are and what you can do about it. Then third, I want to know what climate actions you've wanted to take and what's holding you back from those. And think back to the stuff that I mentioned about block power. Like one of my fundamental beliefs is that the reason that we're not seeing the massive climate action that we wish would be possible isn't necessarily entirely wrapped up in malevolence or people trying to stop action. Some of it certainly is. A lot of it, I think, is captured by people who want to take action but don't necessarily know how, or are busy, like we all have a lot on our plates, and it's hard to figure out how to do it. And so I'm really interested to know, what are the things that you've wanted to do, and what's keeping you from doing that. And so I want to put, this is my last slide here. I want to put those three things up. My email address is there. I'd really love for everyone to write and engage, because the part that I talked about with innovation, trying to fill the gaps, it's really what we want to do at the core of our work, to identify what are the hurdles, what are the things that are keeping us right now from really large scale implementation of climate action, and what could we do to help Lancaster step into what I think is our opportunity to be a real leader in climate. So thank you for your attention today. I look forward to your questions and comments, and please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to engage. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Eric. That was really amazing. And a couple of key points of your message that I really liked, that really struck home with me, was moving from hopelessness to abundance, and really looking at this as an opportunity to not just respond, but really create the world that we want, that is regenerative and more equitable. And part of that inspired that was the conversations that you had with farmers, and how great that was. And you're so right that so farmers are so intimately associated and depend on the natural cycles. And I feel like a lot of times farmers get a bad rap for all the negative stuff that happens as a process of agriculture. But we did have a question which I agree with, and how do we can we message tell a story about farmers as the highlighting them for the good practices that they implement?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think we're starting to see that more with a lot of the water work that's happening here in Lancaster, and I think there are real opportunities to do that in climate as well. What farmers have done here locally has been really impressive, and that doesn't mean that there's not still a lot more to do. And I think it's really important that we create the structures that allow them to keep exploring and keep advancing the work that they're doing as well. One of my takeaways from the past couple of years has been just how creative and resilient farmers are, and also how farmers in this area, because of all of these changes and because of the history of conservation implementation over the last 40, 50 plus years, has really been this practice of continual change. And I think that's a really important skill set that's been cultivated here. Yeah.
And I really loved how you took the drawdown solutions pie chart and made it local. But we did have a question on that. It had, one fairly large section on that pie chart had educating women. Why was educating women on there and not educating both sexes or more than women represented on that chart?
Yeah, that's a solution from drawdown. We have not modeled the similar the similar question here locally. But from the drawdown global analysis, educating women and family planning together, if combined, were the largest solution. And I don't want to speak entirely for drawdown for that, but it has a lot to do with the empowerment that's given to families when women are given educational opportunities and are given the opportunity to lead their households.
Yeah, excellent. And then, how do you handle climate change communication messaging in a population that maybe doesn't even think climate change is real?
Yeah, so Regen has been something that I've been working to develop for the last 2 to 3 years. And we've tried really hard to stay under the radar until recently, because we wanted to have enough materials together and enough clarity to be able to show what we're trying to do. And yeah, in doing that, I was just very worried about what I've also seen become a reality for the Green New Deal. Right away, there were a few things that were targeted in that to say, like, they don't want us to fly, or we can't eat meat anymore, or no ice cream. Like, there were just a couple things that were picked out of that were really blown out of proportion. But I feel like you do have an opportunity at a local scale to reframe this. If you look at the Yale program on climate communication, there's some really incredible long-ranging survey data there that they've done. But it gives a temperature on a number of different core questions about climate communication and perception in the general population. And one of the things, and it's split down by county level. And one of the things that's really important takeaway from that is like 65, 70% of Lancaster is in favor of more clear climate action work. So this isn't something that's just along partisan lines by any means. And I think if we're only looking for national partisan solutions to this, it stifles a lot of creativity and opportunity that's coming from people from both sides of the aisle that just can't find a home in the national political dialogue.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, so on this end, right, the climate deniers, and on the other end, you've got the early adopters. And you talked about engaging with those early adopters as maybe the first folks that would think about purchasing offsets. And we had a couple of questions related to that offset concept. And one was the $15 per ton figure that was on that slide and the source of that, because it felt like that was not accurate to one of our viewers, especially when you look at the social cost of carbon.
Yep.
And then second to that is, how the whole offset process works. Do the offsets go to Regen all, or do they go somewhere else?
Yeah, so the cost of carbon right now is a really really dynamic global thing. So you can find carbon for $3 to $5. You can find carbon on markets for 30 plus, and then, as the questioner rightly stated, there's the social cost of carbon that encapsulates, if we were to pay the real cost for what the impact of carbon is, what would it cost? And it's upwards of $250, $300 per ton. So there's a really wide range here. A number that has very frequently come up, especially in a lot of the carbon spaces, has been the $15 per ton price. And we still need to do more project implementation and verification to see, like, is that a price that we can do all of these different projects with, you know, and what kind of mix will we need to, because some projects will be a lot cheaper, others will be more expensive. I've wanted to avoid having a cost of carbon tied specifically to projects, because we're developing an oversight board to look at how those funds are distributed to projects. And we want to see that there's deep wisdom behind how that money gets distributed, so that we see impacts go to rural and urban communities, that there are issues of equity that are considered in how those funds are distributed, and that all of the money doesn't just go to whatever the sexiest carbon project is. Like, I don't know what that is exactly, but that there's distribution to that. So it is a bit of a thing that we're trying to figure out as we go along, you know, how that price will emerge, if 15 is where it needs to eventually land. The way that we are administering that is that we take a portion for the development and identification of those projects, about 15%. So that's designed to amplify this work, but then the rest is going to these projects on the ground.
Awesome. Have you had any involvement with local utilities at all on working on reducing their contribution to overall carbon?
I have not, and yeah, look forward to possibilities there. I know there's certainly a need and interest to do so from utilities, and there are different places, like through rebates for energy audits and different places like that, where I can see really easy and natural places to plug in. But yeah, there's still projects in the hopper.
Yeah. So is anybody working on biochar in Lancaster? Maybe if you could talk a little bit about what biochar is.
Yeah. So biochar is a combustion product at low oxygen, like a charcoal. It's really incredible because it has incredibly high surface area. It can soak up nutrients in soils. It can create all kinds of pore space for fungi to proliferate. It's really exciting stuff, and it locks a lot of carbon in the biochar itself in ways that we feel is just about as permanent as any kind of land carbon project can get. So biochar is awesome. One of the challenges in this area is that soil amendments are so common that biochar is a little bit harder to make really attractive. Through Team Ag, we've looked at a couple different projects in larger scale feasibility for biochar. And as of a couple years ago, it didn't really pencil out. But then we didn't have other things like potential carbon markets that would help to make that possible either. So, you know, one of the goals that I don't know that I explicitly said with the carbon fund is the desire to make much smaller and different types of carbon reducing projects actually feasible and viable. Like when you have to have these huge projects to make the verification costs work, you can't enter that if you're a farmer with 100 acres, or if you're a homeowner with an attic that you want to insulate. But they're just as valid projects, and we feel like they should also be able to receive, even if it's small, some amount of money that helps to make things viable. And to the previous question about cost, we wanted to make it a cost that people could imagine actually paying. And for a typical homeowner, where we have the carbon price right now, it's a bit of a lift, but it's something that you could imagine doing as an annual cost in your budget. But hope that it's also something that incentivizes other improvements to keep ratcheting that down every year.
Yeah. Would you say that most of the Lancaster County farmers that you've met with agree that they've seen climate change related changes in recent years on their farms?
Yeah, and I don't look for agreement in what is causing it.
Yeah.
But there's almost universal acknowledgement that things are weird, and they're really different from what they remember, and that especially 2018, the just huge amounts of rain really fast. The types of predictions that we see for this region continue to bear out slowly over time. And I'd also encourage you to find something to watch. Like my father-in-law has been recording the date that pine needles in their backyard drop every year for the past 10, 15 years. And it's just a slow trend. So there's things that we can observe and make climate much more tangible to each of us.
Yeah, definitely. There's some really cool citizen science projects related to that as well, that really have shown shifts in some of the natural cycles over the last couple of decades. Mm-hmm. Is there a good list for people to access on the best ways that they can reduce their individual carbon footprints?
Yeah, so we have a lot of resources on the Regen website for how households can really engage in that. So I'd direct people there.
Awesome. And then somebody had an idea that I think is kind of cool. So you're familiar, I think, with Millard Fuller, who founded Habitat for Humanity, and he developed a fund for humanity. And this person felt like the Community Climate Fund sounded similar to Millard Fuller's Fund for Humanity, and maybe a narrative could be developed that grounds the fund, the climate Community Climate Fund, to the big picture, like funding for future generations or something along those lines. I thought that was kind of a neat angle to look at.
Yeah, I think it's awesome, and I'd show the picture of my kids, and that has been the common theme that has united so many of the people that I've gotten to work alongside. Climate is personal in the eyes of their children, grandchildren, or the young people that they see, and it's really obvious that that young people are hurting and asking for us to step up and saying, like I've never wanted my kids to say, Dad, like, what were you doing when you knew that this was happening? Yeah. What were you doing? And so that's what's driven me. I want to make it very clear, and I believe we have an incredible opportunity to do that here in the place where we are.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that certainly resonates with me. That's a motivator for what I'm doing with the Conservancy is when my kids ask, my grandkids ask, what did you do?
Yeah.
I've got something pretty solid I could stand on and say, this is the action that I took. And I agree with you. I think we have a lot of opportunity right here in our community that I didn't realize before an hour ago. So Eric, thank you so much for bringing that hope to me at least. And I think to the rest of our audience. And, you know, something that's going to stick with me is that hopelessness to abundance concept and that regeneration concept. And certainly the work that the Conservancy does plays a role in that. I saw, you know, we're one of those pie charts, one of those non-silver bullet solutions. And thanks for highlighting all the things that people can do. Folks, please check out Regen All and share your ideas with Eric. Eric, once again, thank you so much for spending your time and expertise with us. Everybody, we'll see you on the next Nature Hour. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you all.